Come before you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I would like to say to those who may be new or visiting, I apologize. We don't typically start late, but you have to understand we squeezed in an annual meeting between our 8 a.m. service and our 10:15 service, which by Episcopalian standards is almost miraculous. And so it left us scrambling and just a few minutes late getting into here. So my apologies if you are here for the first time. We welcome you and we're glad that you are here. And you may also be relieved to know that in the past, my practice had been to roll part of my rector's report on an annual meeting Sunday into the sermon, but I've given up that practice this year and I'm just preaching on the gospel. Can I get an amen? It's good news, right? So we had the Gospel of Mark, and then we had some more good news. So it's a good start anyway. Well, we continue this morning in early in the Gospel of Mark. We pick up right where we left off last week. Last week I gave a little bit of an overview of those early verses that even led into that story. As Jesus emerged from the wilderness and being tempted by the devil after his baptism, he immediately goes and he calls disciples to follow him. And I suggested to you that part of the reason he calls people to go along with him is because he wanted witnesses, people to bear witness and remember and recall to us those things that Jesus will teach and do throughout his ministry. And in truth, this is part of the reason, but it's more than that, because Jesus, as a rabbi, would have been expected to have followers, people who would go along with him. And frankly, probably not a bad idea traveling in ancient Judea to have a few traveling companions as well. Because he calls them, as you might recall, while near Galilee, and now they're traveled to Capernaum. So already they're traveling around Israel, and Jesus begins his teaching. So it says they travel to Capernaum, and they're there, and then when the Sabbath comes, they go to the temple. Now, I have not been to a temple, particularly in ancient Israel, as I suppose is true for all of us. So even if we were to go to the temple today, practices may have changed some. But I think what we might have expected to see as Jesus and his disciples arrived at the temple was a place and a time for ritual cleansing as people prepared to enter the temple, and probably some form of formal liturgy or set of prayers that would be offered as the body gathered. But it's more than that, because they stayed on after, and they had time to converse with one another and with the scribes and the rabbis there. Now, this is significant because, Jesus just traveled to Capernaum. He wasn't on the preaching rota. I mean, he wasn't like the guest preacher for the day. He wasn't part of their formal liturgy. But any rabbi or scribe would have taken a place to answer questions, because faithful Jews, as they gathered at the temple, would have brought with them their concerns, the troubles that they were facing in their life. Unlike us today, they would not have had multiple copies of a Bible sitting at home. They didn't have an app to consult the Torah. They needed to go consult with the scribes and the rabbis when they had trouble to know what the law and what God would have them do. So they might come and present a question to a rabbi or a scribe about some business that they were engaged in, or a trouble that they were having with a colleague. Or they may come and say, I'm having this problem with my father or my family, and I need to know what the law says about a situation like this. And I think we see this distinction borne out as this gospel unfolds, because it says that the scribes didn't teach with authority. And what I think this implies to us is that they are just offering what the law says. So you imagine with me, after the formal liturgy has been complete, there may be several scribes and rabbis around the temple, people crowding around to take turns in asking them about the law and the questions or the troubles that they have, right? And so you might go to a scribe and say, I have been in business with this colleague, and what am I supposed to do about this situation? And they would say, well, the law says this. Now, that could be frustrating too, because while you know what the law says, it's like, but how am I supposed to interpret that? That was more the rabbi's rule, right? And people would sit around and listen to the questions of others because it might help them understand a situation they were in. But it might be frustrating if they only ever said, well, the law says this. Well, the law says this. But what am I supposed to do, right? I mean, this is the challenge we still face when we're trying to be obedient to the law. It's like, well, what do we do when two laws conflict with each other? How do I fulfill or honor God when the challenge, because often life gets complicated, doesn't it? And so as Jesus takes his place among the scribes and the rabbis in the temple, quickly he is noted as one who is teaching with authority. So instead of just saying, well, the law says this, he's saying, imagine it to be this other way. What's really fascinating about this passage to me is that Mark, the author of this gospel, or whomever he's receiving this story from, doesn't bother to capture what Jesus is teaching. They don't bother to write, he's not saying, well, then he taught them this, or he said this about that law. Because the particulars get lost in translation as generations pass. And as the situation changes. Instead, what Mark and the people who are talking to Mark as he forms this gospel, what's most fascinating to them is not the particulars of what is being said in the temple that day, but the spirit in which it's being offered and the authority that emerges as Jesus teaches those who are gathered. You can almost imagine what it would have been like to be in that temple as different scribes and rabbis took their places to answer questions. And you could hear or even feel the energy around Jesus as he did it. And suddenly you might even imagine people leaving the scribe or Pharisee or the teacher or the rabbi that they're standing by to go listen a little bit closer to what Jesus is saying, as they marvel at the authority with which he teaches. Then the Gospel of Mark says, just then a man with a demon appears. Now this may seem like, okay, he just manifests himself, but it's interesting because there was he would have been unclean by temple standards. He would have had a hard time getting in. The ushers in that day were a little more heavy-handed than the ones today, I have to tell you. Here they say, welcome to Ascension, come right in. They don't ask if you have demons, they just welcome you. It's funny until the preacher gets interrupted by someone shouting out. Now, you might not have experienced this lately, but I have to tell you that I have experienced someone shouting out in the middle of a sermon. And I'm not Jesus. I did not cast the demon out. I wrapped up rather quickly that day. Because it's hard to focus in the presence of something like that. And this does capture everybody's attention because this probably isn't the first time it happened at a temple. I just told you it's still happening in God's temple. And instead of just declaring the man unclean and having someone help usher him out or excuse him, Jesus addresses it directly. And while we might not have a demon that makes us shout out during worship, we probably all wrestle with things, have demons in our own life that need to be confronted. I believe this passage in Mark is calling us to allow Jesus to enter into those troubled places that we have, to allow Jesus to help us to confront those demons that we face on a regular basis, even the ones that don't make us shout out in the course of worship because they still trouble us. And the power of Jesus is ready to confront those on our behalf. And I think there's really good news in this Gospel of Mark. And I'm almost grateful that they don't capture the particulars of what Jesus was saying as he captures their imagination with the authority with which he offers it. Because if they recorded all the things that Jesus said that day, it would squash our imaginations and we would get hung up on the particulars. But instead, we're left to recognize that it was less about the specific words that Jesus offered and more about being in the presence of the Lord. And the reason this is really good news is that the presence of the Lord is still with us. Jesus, before he departs, conveys his Spirit upon his disciples that they might share it with all who believe, with all who would follow Jesus. The church has instituted sacraments to make visible that which is invisible, the presence of God among us. The power and authority that we read of in this gospel that captures everybody's attention and their imaginations is available to us as we gather around this altar and celebrate the sacraments of the church. The power and authority that we read of in this gospel is available to us each time we visit somebody who is in the hospital or in distress. The power and authority that we read of in this gospel exists when we go over to Stultz Elementary and help mentor the students, because there is a manifestation of God that exists there even when we don't utter God's name. The power and authority of this gospel that we read of that Jesus displays so clearly in the temple on the day in this gospel passage is available every time we extend help to those in need, speak up for those who are being trampled down, or just sit with somebody who needs to be heard. This Gospel of Mark tells a story of Jesus in a temple offering authority and power, casting out demons. Might make it feel like a far-off thing, but I'm here to remind us that the power and authority that Jesus demonstrates is what we enter into in this community of faith at Ascension. It exists in our gathering, and it exists in our going out. Amen.